Jeffrey Moser is assistant professor in the history of art and architecture at Brown University. He's been working on the Sanli too for over 10 years. I would probably, his dissertation, 2010 dissertation on Song antiquarianism contains like a substantial chapter on Chongyi and his Sanli too. He is actually currently completing a manuscript, a book manuscript, on that work entitled Nominal Things, Bronzes, Schemata, and Hermeneutics of Facture in Northern Song China. He's published numerous articles on Song antiquarianism, and he's, on top of all of this, preparing an exhibition on the extraordinary finds of the Liu family tombs outside Xi'an, which include the tombs of the famous scholar Liu Dalin, who wrote the Kaogutu. Again, we will hear a lot more, I presume, of all these people and books later this afternoon. So he will, Jeffrey Moser will speak to us on Chongyi's visual hermeneutics. Welcome, Jeffrey Moser.
So thank you, Francois, for that very generous introduction. And I'd also like to begin by thanking everyone at the Bard Graduate Center who made this event possible, especially Laura Minsky for handling all of the practicalities, and of course, Francois himself. When I first became interested in the Sanli too, and it was about a decade ago, Francois very generously shared with me the manuscript that became the basis for at least some of the material published in the catalog. And that saved me an inordinate amount of time and work. That kind of intellectual generosity that he displayed there is still on display here in this exhibition and event that we're all participating in. It's wonderful to have you all here. The Sanli, when I started thinking about this 10 years ago, I never thought that we could actually have a whole conference on the Sanli too. So this is just incredibly exciting for me, and I will try to contain my excitement while I move through my presentation so that you can actually understand why I'm interested in this text. Because Francois has provided such a lucid introduction to the text itself, I get to do the wonderful job of skipping over all of that background material and plunging right into my central question, which is what is the nature of Chongyi's visual hermeneutics? What is he trying to do with his interpretation? What did he set out to accomplish? And how did he accomplish it? And by this, my primary focus here is looking at the way in which the text itself articulates his arguments, the way in which the text itself articulates his ambitions. I'm going to begin by examining the short editorial preface that Nye appended to the end of the text. This provides a synopsis of what Nye himself understood to be the goals and methods of his project. It also helps us to identify the primary assumptions and priorities that drove the compilation of the Sanli Tu. With this as a basis, I'll then attempt to clarify what these ostensible methods actually meant in practice using a couple of examples. So the postface lays out its problem in a relatively straightforward section. And I was expecting I would have a laptop here, so I'm going to read it this way. The 10 fascicles of old illustrations are missing shapes and lacking words, and their rules governing the apportioning of ritual forms according to rank are inconsistent. They offer nothing to follow, and it is difficult to obtain figures from them. This is because the compilers just carried on traditional practice without knowing where it came from. So essentially the problem is that habit has become classically unsubstantiated. The implicit argument is that the designs in the existing body of ritual images that Chongyi had inherited were insufficient for the ceremonial needs of the present. Now he continues in this longer passage, and I'm going to focus in on 3 key lines in this passage, or actually four lines in this passage. The first, he says, in cases of discrepancy in name and number, this is where he's talking about how he actually proceeded with his analysis, but consistency in design and measure, I can't quite see. I recorded the name, but left out the design. In other words, when multiple names in the classics referred to the same thing, or when rituals called for duplicates of the same name, of the same object, he did not make duplicate images of the same thing. He is not transforming each word into a picture, in other words, but articulating the graphic logic that precedes the words. Secondly, in cases where a name meant multiple things, but the old illustrations left them out, where there were general categories that had not been subdivided into specific types, I added one in each case. In other words, he is, however, making new pictures, and he's doing this of previously unillustrated names. And he does this if, and this is key, they belong to a more general category for which he already possesses a graphic schemata in the inherited illustrations that he's working from. And then third, he says, and this is key as well, and as for those cases where there were names but no designs, I left them out without drawing a picture. So in other words, he is not making pictures up out of thin air. If his sources do not offer a design, a picture, or the formal details necessary to make a picture, he leaves the name out. Lastly, all of the commentaries that I compiled are based on the correct classics of the Duke of Zhou as set down by Confucius, with annotations by Kangcheng, that being Zhengshuan, and further support from the sub-commentaries. For those matters that the classical sources do not address, I extrapolated on the basis of the Han Dynasty system. In those cases where the illustrations were insufficient, I filled in these lacuna with detailed evidence in the catalog entries. I also examined recent ritual in detail and thoroughly considered its historical development. In other words, the entire tradition of ritual classics, commentaries, sub-commentaries, as well as earlier and contemporary practices of state ritual were all fair game. Here, his statement follows classical priority, but as we shall see, he actually does not always emphasize priority to the same degree in his entries. Many of his entries allow a sub-commentary of one text to overrule the original line of one of the classics in a different text in determining what object or image should be made in response to the names therein. Okay, and in the end, he explains the scope of his achievement, which is, to his mind, a coherent ritual order that graphically instantiates the principles of hierarchy implicit in normative Confucian models of governance and social organization. I'll skip over the first line. The ceremonial apparel now shows the figures for auspicious and inauspicious rites. The palaces, halls, carriages, and banners show the designs of past and present. The bows, arrows, and archery targets show difference in rank. The bells, drums, pipes, and chimes show the balancing of rules and measures. The sacrificial implements and sacrificial jade show the quantities appropriate to status. The jade tablets, discs, and silk wrappers show the order of lords and servants. And the mourning and burial paraphernalia show the arrangement of those above and below. When rituals are implemented on this basis, it will be easy to review them precisely. So that's his essential argument. And so now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how he actually goes through, what his hermeneutics were, how he interpreted the sources, his interpretive devices that he used in order to make sense of this immense body of visual material that he had inherited. So I'm gonna focus on three key qualities of his hermeneutics. The first is that they're additive. And what do I mean by their being additive? When Chongyi was faced with discrepancies between the descriptions that different sources provided for objects belonging to a common formal category, he typically expanded the system to accommodate each description as a discrete object. In other words, he dealt with variation by isolating rather than equating different alternatives. That's a mouthful. What I'm trying to explain can be shown here in his example, using the example of the archery targets. And I've just put 4 of the 15 archery targets illustrated in the Sanli 2 up here for you to look at while I explain his approach. So as his substantial preface to these entries explains, the ritual classics include a number of different references to archery targets. The heavenly offices section of the rites of Zhou refers to 3 targets, those being the tiger target, the bear target, and the leopard target. The summer offices section of the rites of Zhou refers to 3 targets that are distinguished by having respectively 5, 3, and 2 concentric rings. The suburban archery section of the Book of Ceremony and Rites lists 4 targets that are distinguished from one another on the basis of both their appearance and the status of the archer. Here's a quote. The Son of Heaven uses a bear target with a white surface. The noble lords use an elk target with a red surface. The grandees use a target covered with fabric upon which tigers and leopards are painted. And the yeomen or shur use a target covered with fabric upon which deer and boar are painted. When faced with these different lists, one could, we imagine, attempt to correlate, for instance, the bear target in the Rites of Joe with the bear target in the Book of Ceremony and Rites. Or, for instance, possibly suggest that the tiger target was the one that had 5 rings, the bear target the one with 3, and the leopard target the one with 2. Nie Chongyi does not do that. He doesn't actually try to correlate these different references, but instead asserts that each list refers to an entirely distinct set of targets, and then he proceeds to produce a separate illustrated entry for each member of each set. By the time he is finished, he has a total of 15 different targets, which are far more than those described in any single classical source. So in other words, rather than treating discrepancies between the commentaries and the classics, or between the classics and other classics, as contradictions demanding resolution, which later scholars from the 11th century on would do, he expanded his system to amalgamate difference. That's what I understand to be his additive approach. Second approach is he involved a sense of literal figuration. And to do this, he employed 2 basic hermeneutic tools. The first of these was the basic idea that in the rituals of the Zhou dynasty, implements were decorated according to their type. The second, and so for example, the ox cauldron is an ox cauldron because it has oxes on its surface. The jade jue is a jue because jue is associated with sparrows, and so you have a sparrow sculpted in there. The chicken E vessel is a chicken E vessel because there's a chicken on it, and the mountain zun is a mountain zun because there's mountains on it. That sort of literal rendering of decoration according to type. The second principle, which he uses as a sort of mechanism for amalgamating different ways in which this interpretive approach was demonstrated or realized in the received illustrations that he had, is this. In some cases, the thing that corresponded to the object's name was painted in full. In other cases, the shape derived from the object's category was sculpted in part. And so we have 2 examples on the right of being sculpted in part, and 2 examples on the left of being painted in full. So much as the additive hermeneutic employed with the archery targets enabled the integration of diverse classical references into a single coherent system, decorating vessels according to their type rationalized the formal diversity of prescriptive ritual models that Nie Chongyi had inherited from earlier exegetes. It suggested that the names given to these objects in the ritual classics, wherever possible, should be read as figures, or shang, for flora and fauna that could be represented literally and thereby formally manifest distinctions in nomenclature. This made the relationship between names and things at least apparently transparent. Nie Chongyi did not want the relationships between names and things to appear arbitrary. He did not want it to appear to be the result of human intervention. And that matters because the third category is that he focuses on what I would call an atemporal or a detemporalizing approach, in which he focuses on eliminating the chatter of historical variation and asserting his models as instantiations of an underlying natural order that preceded the chronological changes in form that happened over time. He is not interested, by and large, in the way forms evolved over time. He treats historical variation as superficial and seeks the underlying design that persists unchanging over time. And one of the ways he does this is by recalculating all of the dimensions for all of these objects, or at least many of these objects, using what's known as the millet-inch rule. And this expression we see quite regularly in his entries on sacrificial vessels. Now I calculate its dimensions with the millet-inch rule. This millet-inch rule is accorded its own independent entry at the head of the section on sacrificial jades. In this entry, Nie explains the measure with a citation from the dynastic history of the Han Dynasty, in which he writes, each unit is equivalent to the width of a sheaf of millet. 10 units is 1 inch, and 10 inches is 1 foot. Thus the measure, but not the measurement itself, has both a textual and a natural precedent. Because the millet-inch rule is not what earlier illustrations used to calculate dimensions, its adoption by Nie serves as a convenient pretext for establishing new standard measurements. And this is one of the things that he was most criticized for by some of his contemporaries. He does this throughout the text. Textual precedent, in other words, supplies the justification for Nie's proposal, but it doesn't provide its substance. It doesn't provide the actual measurements themselves. Those he makes up. But he does so in a way that ensures that variations in dimension logically reproduce the variations in rank and position that the wider ritual system was meant to instantiate. I'm going to skip over a section where I can talk a little bit more about some of the ways he was criticized for this. In the Q&A, if you're interested, we can come back to it. By deriving from nature the standard units in which the dimensions of his ritual implements were measured, Nie reinforced the sense of timelessness implied in the postface. These are not units of the Zhou or of the Han or of any other particular period. They are rather the measures of an eternal natural order. Now, a parallel here between the way ritual forms and language were being understood exists in the 10th century. Now, this is precisely the moment when Xu Kai and Xu Xuan were compiling their influential commentaries on the Shuowenjiezi, China's earliest dictionary, and elaborating the implications of its author Xu Xuan's views. Xu Xuan had famously asserted that the ancient sage Cangji had invented writing by observing the presence of meaningful patterns in the tracks of animals. And thus seeing writing ultimately as deriving not from human beings but from nature itself. Nie Chongyi similarly gestures to the timeless natural order as the basis for ritual. So, to look at how he put these methods into practice, I'm just going to use one example here, which is the yellow yi vessel, the huangyi, which is essentially a vessel that was designed for holding fragrant liquor. And Nie Chongyi has a series of different interpretations from different sources that he draws upon in his commentary. And you can see that there's a bit of a discrepancy between these two interpretations. In the first case, Zheng Xuan says that the yellow yi means yellow eyes, and that gold is used for the eyes. So associates the vessel with eyes. The second commentary, or with the second line, which is actually taken from the Book of Rites, says that yellow means within. Eyes, which means that which makes the vapor clear. This means that when liquor is within, it is clearly visible on the outside. In other words, what we have are two different ways of thinking about why this term eyes becomes associated in classical commentaries with the yellow E. One of them being that because it actually has eyes on its surface, the other being that it somehow allows vision to access what's going on inside the vessel. Now, the other thing that he has is he already has a number of vessels that are called E vessels, right? And he has a certain basic schemata of shape associated with those vessels. And it's clear that in selecting this as the image for the yellow E, he's employing that. We see here clearly that this is the shape of the E, and he notes up above that below it is a stand, which represents this entire area. Now, the use of the literal rendering is obvious here in that even though he doesn't resolve the question of which of these two whether or not these two different commentaries are sense ambiguous, whether they're actually referring to the same thing or something different, he doesn't seek to resolve that logically in the text, but he clearly resolves it visually in the picture. Now, in a few cases, Nie is remarkably honest and forthright about the limitations of his hermeneutic. In the case of the so-called Shen-style Zun vessels, he has 4 different received interpretations of what this word Shen means. And of those 4 interpretations, he narrows it down to 2, that being Zheng Xuan's interpretation that it means a dancing phoenix, and the other being Ran Shen's interpretation that it means having a cow on the surface. And then in his entry, he says quite tersely, please select one. Ultimately, the forms that he proposes are not bounded by textual precedent. He draws upon classical texts and commentaries. But ultimately, the raw material that he is seeking to organize and elaborate is not just the words in the classical texts, but the corpus of pictures that he has inherited. His aim is to rationalize these pictures by developing coherent, systematic relationships between the forms represented in those pictures and the names associated with those forms. He uses texts, but he uses them to work through and make sense of a body of visual material. Hermeneutic devices like the literalization of name in painted full or sculpted part, and the assertion of new dimensions denoted in the millet-inch rule help him to accomplish this end. And so I'd like to close now with a somewhat broader reflection on the nature of the images in the Sanli Tu and the nature of images in prescriptive ritual imagery in China more generally. There is a tendency in some of the work that has been done on the broader question of how ritual images or ritual forms were graphically instantiated to use what is clearly apparent in the tradition of reproducing images of actual artifacts that were discovered in the Song dynasty as a kind of framework for thinking about what's happening in ritual imagery. So, as scholars have demonstrated, the range of different printed editions of the same catalog of ancient bronzes that had been rediscovered in the 11th century demonstrate that there is considerable variation in terms of the overall quality of the image in these different editions. And you can see that across these three examples that I've shown here. These are the same image, same object represented in the same catalog, just two different printed editions. Or in fact, the one on the left is the hand-drawn version from the Sikuchen Chu. To suggest that one of the things that quite often happens in the reproduction of printed imagery is that you see a general deterioration in the relative amount of detail, that we see a significant variation within different printed editions in the amount of detail and quality of form. We know, and I think we'll hear much more about today, that from the 11th century on, a new system for organizing or for creating ritual images was generated. One of the key figures in this longer history is Ouyang Shou. He noted in reference to things like Chongyi Sanli Tu that when ritual experts make gui vessels, they do so on the basis of transmitted sayings, but do not know the actual shape and dimension of these vessels. Thus, the name is preserved, but the substance is lost. This vessel, meaning this bronze vessel that he had just he was commenting upon, could be used to correct this mistake. And comments like this abound in the cataloging and study of ancient bronzes from the 11th century on in the century following Chongyi. And we know, on the basis of scholarship done by many people here in this room today, that those illustrations of bronzes served as the basis for the production of new prescriptive ritual imagery that would be used as models for producing new ritual vessels. What is striking, though, is that nowhere in the larger corpus of prescriptive ritual imagery, not descriptive archaeological imagery, but prescriptive ritual imagery, do we see finely detailed, carefully rendered designs. By and large, most of what we see are relatively simple designs. Whether we're looking at the tradition that came out of the Sanli Tu, or whether we're looking at the tradition that came out of bronzes found in the earth. Now, the role that highly detailed, I'll keep on this for a second, the role that highly detailed descriptive images of ancient bronzes played in the development of new prescriptive ritual imagery from the 12th century on has led some to assume that more detailed ritual images once stood behind the so-called crude images that survive to this day. I think that this is a misperception, and I think it's a mistake that results from assuming observational empiricism as the basis for illustration. We are the inheritors of a long tradition of such empiricism, and the Song dynasty had this tradition as well. But the thing with ritual imagery is that it is not prompted by things out in the world. It is prompted by operations of language. The key is that differences in form correspond to differences in nomenclature. All differences in nomenclature are formally expressed, and thus by implication not arbitrary, and all differences in form are expressed in name. What we have here, in other words, are lexical pictures. As lexical pictures, these images do what linguists would refer to as nominal classification. They convey the essential characteristics that distinguish one noun from another noun, and thus one category from another category. They are not about drawing one particular thing, but establishing the essential elements of a category of things. The simplicity of the image conveys its flexibility as a model. It suggests that although the chicken, for example, may be facing to the left, it doesn't ultimately matter if the chicken is facing left or right, or if its head is raised or lowered. The work that the images do is the work of denoting a formal category, not the work of representing an actual thing in the world. The essential message that their schematic simplicity conveys to the viewer, in other words, is not that you should make the chicken look this way exactly, but rather that what makes a chicken E, and not some other kind of E, is the presence of a two-dimensional representation of a chicken on the E. In this sense, they are fundamentally pictures of schemata, not pictures of things. They don't picture the material world, they put words into it. The simplicity of these images, in other words, is central to their nature. If we think in terms of propagating standards, the schematic simplicity of these images has a practical benefit. It is a lot easier to convey a standard if the standard you want to convey is simple and diagrammatic rather than detailed and ekphrastic. Like written words, Nie Chongyi's images worked well because they were easy to reproduce. Like writing, they traveled far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. This was wonderful and beautifully articulated, very complicated concepts. We have time for questions. Maybe we need a few seconds to think of some, but are there any questions?
How did this segue with the development of the Chinese language?
That's a good question. So I guess what I would say is I could talk about it more intelligently if I related to the development of Chinese writing and the understanding of the relationship between writing and language. So the essential argument of the Shuowenjiezi, which is really repurposed in the 10th century as that early dictionary I was mentioning is reorganized and as promulgated once again, is the idea that words history affects language. There's a recognition that history affects language, that the words we use change over time, that the writing that we use to represent things changes over time. Actually, most of the dictionary is focused on tracing those changes in the formal graphic instantiation of words across long spans of time. But ultimately, all of that change is understood as the corruptions of human beings. That the underlying basis of language is natural, not man-made, not artificial. And so the idea that what one does as a scholar in studying language or in studying ritual is to articulate some sort of underlying natural order to things, I think is common across these two traditions. And that persists, at least as an idea in the study of the Chinese language, almost all the way down to the 20th century. I mean, of course, it suffers in the wake of Saussurean linguistics, but the idea that there's a sort of natural order to be understood is, I think, common. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, I came in late, but it looked like you wanted to say something about the birds.
The birds. These birds.
Yeah.
These birds. So what I wanted to say is that, one of the times we have a tendency, I think there's an unfortunate tendency that being the products of a sort of post-enlightenment mode of empirical observation, that when we look at encyclopedias and various ways of taking what I see in the world and organizing it into categories, we think in terms of, well, that should start with observational empiricism. And then what we observe should be broken down into arbitrary categories that we as human beings create through language. And my point in throwing this up there is that's radically not what Nie Chongyi was doing. He is instead starting from the language itself, treating the language itself as what's the most real thing, and then building forms out of that language. And so I think when scholars will question the quality of his illustrations for not doing the kinds of things that we associate with more finely refined drawings of objects in nature, for being overly simplistic, It's because they're not meant to be descriptive in the first place. Those images were never meant to be descriptive. They were meant to be prescriptive, and they were meant to do in form what words do in language.
Question?
No.
There is always a recognized tradition in Chinese visual culture that is to separate tool, diagrams, or like you said, visual elements that form syntax, but also hua, which is something that's come from entirely different desire to recapture nature. So how would that work up in your theories here?
At least from what I've read in the Sanli 2, I wouldn't overly nominalize it. I think he uses different terms for picturing, whether it's hua or tu or yang. In some cases interchangeably. I think actually what happens with those words is determined by the context, and we have to determine what he means by the context in which he's actually using it, in the specific context of the writing. I mean, the specific context of the passage where he uses that. I don't see an absolute distinction in his use of the term tu and his use of the term hua, for example. I mean, I recognize that there is a larger tradition of thinking about that in the Chinese context, but at least the way he uses those terms in his text, I don't see that that matters too much to him.
Why was the invention of the milli-inch so criticized?
Because it had no basis in antiquity, because they recognized that he was making up measurements. And the point was that the earliest classical precedents for measurements, if I'm not mistaken, and Francois can correct me, is that the earliest sources that they had for actual measurements in the commentarial tradition dated back just to the 6th century AD. So, I mean, the essential criticism was from those who wanted to hold on to that earlier sub-commentarial tradition, who said that he had no right to just make up new measurements. But his argument is that, well, those were just later historical attempts to interpret this in the first place, and if we can create a new standard that's lodged in antiquity, lodged in nature, and that I can now use uniformly to organize the dimensions of all of these things so that they're rational, that seemed to him a much more persuasive approach.
One more.
Is it wrong to compare him a little bit with Aristotle in terms of his thinking, just for fun?
Oh.
You know, I'm thinking of whatever, you have an idea, the chair, and then there are so many of those chairs. That may be
there is an unfortunate Aristotelian and Kantian subtext for schemata in my approach to this that working through is probably going to take a bit more time than I have here in the Q&A. But I do think that I think you're right. I think it's fair to say that at some basic level, what he is doing is, I don't want to push the analogy too far, but at least shares certain qualities with what Aristotle was doing.
Well, I think we should move on. Thank you very much.